logging in to this African Lecture Association series. Welcome to the second of the 2024-2025 ALA lecture series. My name is Simon Lewis, and I'm sitting here in Charleston, South Carolina on a beautiful, very nice, warm fall morning. I currently have the honor to serve as Vice President of the ALA and as the member of the ALA Executive Council who is charged with coordinating these lectures. If you haven't attended one of these lectures before, I'd like to take a moment or two to explain how they work. Guest lecturer today, Professor Mohamed Kamara, is on Zoom with me and with our moderator, Professor Patoimbasba Nikiema, along with web whiz Lexi Langendorf, while you all are watching via the ALA YouTube site. Please, for a start, go ahead and let us know on the YouTube chat where it is that you're logging in from. It's been really good to see in previous sessions that people have been able to tune in from all over the world, which confirms the value of this initiative in broadening the reach of the African Literature Association. Another benefit of this format is that you can post comments and questions whenever they occur to you during the presentation without interrupting the speaker. Please feel free to put those comments and suggestions in the chat at any time. Lexi and I will be monitoring the chat throughout the session, and we'll feed the questions and comments to our presenters for the discussion after the lecture is over. So those are the technical arrangements. Let me now briefly welcome and introduce today's moderator, Professor Patoimbasba Nikiema. Professor Nikiema has been in the US for many years. He did his undergraduate work in Burkina Faso and then came to West Virginia University for his MA, and then followed that up with a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. He's currently an assistant professor of French and Francophone studies / global Black and Afropean studies at the University of Miami down in Florida, where his research focuses on post-colonial studies with a particular interest in Afropean, sub-Saharan, and Caribbean literatures and cultures around questions of migration, diaspora, race, gender, and transnationalism. He's currently working on the participation of transnational African and Afro-diasporic writers in Afrotopia, both on the continent and in the Caribbean. Pat's special interest in today's topic is indicated by the fact that he has also served as the coordinator of one of the ALA's longest standing and most active caucuses, Fracala, the Francophone caucus of the ALA. So welcome, Professor Nikiema. I'm now going to mute myself and turn things over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon, for the introduction. It's also my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mohamed Kamara for his lecture. Mohamed Kamara is the professor of French and Africana Studies and chair of the Romance Language Department at Washington and Lee University in Virginia, where he is also the current holder of the H. Lauren Birch Jr. Term Professorship in International Education. Mohamed's teaching and research interests include French and Francophone literatures and cultures, with specific focus on African and 18th century French women writers, French colonialism, child soldiers, and human rights. He has published short stories and research articles on human rights, the African child soldiers, French colonial education, Sierra Leonean literature, and other areas of African and African diaspora literatures and cultures. He is the author of When Mosquitoes Come Marching In, a play in spectacles under the pen name Mohamed Kamara, and Colonial Legacies in Francophone African Literature, the School and the Invention of the Bourgeoisie. He is currently collaborating on 2 volumes, and the first one is Children and Violence, Agency, Experience, and Representation in and Beyond Armed Conflicts, and the second one is The Literature of Contemporary Sierra Leone, Trauma, Resistance, and Creativity. From 2020 to 2023, Mohamed served as Vice President president and past president of the African Literature Association, after previously serving as treasurer and executive council member of the association. His book, Colonial Legacies and Francophone African Literature, The School and the Invention of the Bourgeoisie, explores the role of colonial education in shaping social hierarchies and creating a colonial bourgeoisie in Francophone Africa. The book critically examines how the French colonial education system contributed to the rise of a class of évolués, African elites who were intermediaries between the colonizers and the colonized. Through their schooling, these individuals adopted European cultural values and were often used by the French colonial administration to maintain control over the African population. The book delves into the cultural, social, and political implications of colonial education, showing how it fostered a deep division within African societies and created a stratified system with lasting legacies. Kamara draws on both historical and literary sources to illustrate how this bourgeoisie class was constructed and its impact on post-colonial African societies. Colonial legacies in Francophone African literature is indispensable for understanding the contemporary post-colonial dynamics of sub-Saharan Africa. The book offers critical insight into ongoing geopolitical developments, including the historic decision by African nations on October 17, 2024, to vote on the United Nations resolution concerning the implementation of a declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples, eradicating colonialism in all its forms and manifestations. This decision underscores the enduring relevance of colonial legacies, particularly in the educational and social structures of Francophone Africa, in shaping both current and future political stances on decolonization. The book first serves as a crucial lens through which to analyze Africa's ongoing negotiations with its colonial past and its efforts to assert political and cultural autonomy on the global stage. So please today, join me in extending a warm welcome to Mohamed Kamara as he presents his lecture on colonial education and social engineering in Francophone African literature. Thank you. You are muted.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pat, for the wonderful introduction. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the African Literature Association, first of all, for organizing this lecture series, which has been going on for a few years and providing this opportunity for writers and others to share their work. And specific thanks to Simon Lewis for extending an invitation to me to talk about my book. And also thank Farah and Lexi for doing mostly the behind the scenes work to make this particular event possible, but also to make the functioning of the African Literature Association a possibility and a benefit for all of us. Thank you to one and all present here now and in the next few minutes or in the future, visiting the YouTube channel to view this particular presentation. The development and evolution of French colonial education policies and practices in sub-Saharan Africa spanned nearly a century and a half, with arguably the most consequential moments occurring during the last 50 years of French colonial rule. That is from 1903 to 1958 or 1960, depending on how you look at the periodization. I'm going to show you a slide quickly here as I speak, so you can see the periodization period I'm talking about in the colonial educational trajectory. 1 second. African literature is a treasure trove of narratives about the colonial school and its impact on the individual and society alike. My monograph comprises an in-depth study of 18 texts from that corpus, produced mostly by writers who went through the colonial educational system. The list includes works published between 1920 and 1997, 3 during the colonial period, 3 in the first decade of independence, that is the 1960s, and then 7 in the 1970s, 3 in the 1980s, and 3 in the 1990s. 9 of the texts have the colonial period as their subject matter, with the exception of Pierre Sami McCoy's L'Odyssée de Mongo from Central Africa and Bernard Nanga's Les Chauves-Souris from Cameroon. All the texts are about West Africa, including Francis Bebe's Le Ministre et le Griot. This novel, though written by a Cameroonian, is about a fictional West African nation just a few years into its independence from France. I included L'Odyssée de Mongo by Pierre Sami in this study for comparative purposes, mainly to show that when it comes to colonial policies and practices regarding education more specifically, the difference between Afrique occidentale française and Afrique équatoriale française, that is AEF, of which Central African Republic, Ubangi-Shari, was part, was merely geographic. As for Les Chauves-Souris, its inclusion here shows how generalized corruption and inefficiency in states run by elements trained in Western education. Even when the text is set in the post-colonial period, take, for example, Amadou Koné's Traite and Les Coupeurs de Tête, Amadou Koné's Traite and Les Coupeurs de Tête, Amadou Koroma's Les Soleils des Indépendances, Ousmane Sembène's Khala, Bernard Dadier's Moi Seul, and Nanga's Les Chauves-Souris, as well as Francis Bebe's Le Ministre et le Griot. It operates on the unmistakable premise of the longue durée of colonization, as is evident in the slow pace or lack of reforms of the educational system inherited at independence. In addition to an introduction and a conclusion, my book is divided into 6 chapters. Chapter 1, Pedagogy of the Colonized, Theories, Ideologies, and Policies of the Colonial School in Francophone Black Africa. This chapter looks at the political and curricular policies of colonial education, as well as the prevailing ideology and theories of race and racial difference that inform their conception, concoction, and implementation. Chapter 2, entitled From Theory to Practice, the Colonial School in Francophone African Literature, is an analysis of Amadou Mapatejans Les Trois Volontés de Mali, Bernard Dadier's Clembier, Cheikh Hamidou Khan's L'Aventure Ambiguë, Pierre Sami's L'Odyssée de Mongo, and Amadou Hampâté-Bâ's Amkoulel, L'Enfant Pearl. This chapter engages the following questions. What are the attitudes of parents, other family members, and the communities vis-a-vis the school? What do the children attending the school, forced or willingly, think about the institution? Why is the school attractive to some and repulsive to others? How do we explain the ambivalent attitude of those who detest and want the school at the same time? Chapter 3, Making Good Wives and Good Mothers, the Education of Women in Colonial West Africa. This chapter highlights the theoretical and practical differences between the education of boys and that of girls in the colonial period. The text examined here are Frida Lawson's short autobiographical text, Je suis une Africaine, j'ai 20 ans, Awa Keita's Femme d'Afrique, la vie d'Awa Keita racontée par elle-même, and Mariam Abbas, Une si longue lettre. Special attention is given in this chapter to women and how women saw themselves, as well as their status and role in the change in Africa through the new lens provided by colonial education. Chapter 4, titled When Slaves, Bastards, and Dogs Rule, the Colonial School as Agent of Social Transformation. This chapter discusses the impact of colonial education on the society as a whole, with specific focus on the question of social transgression as it relates to the emergence of the new intermediary class in an erstwhile caste-based society. The transgression in question was occasioned mainly by the so-called open door policy of the colonial school, which made it generally possible for elements of upper and lower caste to share the same space and educational resources provided by the school, thus changing the continent's social landscape forever. This phenomenon, convincingly portrayed in Amadou Kone's Sous le pouvoir des Blacks, in Francis Bébé's Le Ministre et le Griot, and Amadou Kourouma's Le Soleil des Indépendances, among many other texts, can also be seen in the 3 texts by women discussed in Chapter 3. Chapter 5, the colonial school and the emergence of new African types. In addition to the tension it created between individuals and their traditional African societies, the school, because of the access it provided to power, money, and privilege, also engendered a new individualism. While this chapter focuses preponderantly on the figure of the arrivist, depicted in such literary texts as Bernard Dadier's Messieurs Togonini and Moi Seul, I also look at other types produced by the school in Cheikh Hamidou Khan's Aventure Ambiguë, Ake Loba's Les Fils de Kourecha, and Amadou Patoimbasba's L'étrange destin de Vaincre. In Chapter 6, titled Reality or Invention, Literal Representation of the Bourgeoisie on Trial, I focus more specifically on the modes of representation of the bourgeoisie adopted in literary text. Bernard Dadier's Messieurs Togonini and Moi Seul, Ousmane Sembène's Khala, Bernard Nanga's Les Chauves-souris, Amadou Kone's Les Coupeurs de Tête, and especially Patoimbasba's L'étrange destin de Vaincre, are key texts discussed in this chapter. The book concludes with a retrospective on African literature's representation of the school and the class that emerged from it. More specifically, it assesses the literature as a literature about failure, in the sense that much of the representation of the school and the underdeveloped or artificial bourgeoisie, if you will, that came out of it is about the failure of the class and its individual members to lead Africa to complete decolonization, even decades after the publicly announced end of colonization. The following scene in Nian's Djibril Tamsir Nian Sunjata, an epic of Old Mali, gives us a glimpse into traditional pre-colonial education in an African context. Every evening, Sogolon Keju will gather Sunjata and his companions outside her hut. She will tell them stories about the beasts of the bush, about the dumb brothers of man. Sogolon Jata learned to distinguish between the animals. He knew why the buffalo was his mother's red, and also why the lion was the protector of his father's family. He also listened to the history of the kings, which Balafa Seke told him. Sogolon initiated her son into certain secrets and revealed to him the names of the medicinal plants which every hunter should know. Thus, between his mother and his griot, the child got to know all that needed to be known. At this point in his life, Sunjata, at least in Nian's text, was barely 10 and on the cusp of heading into exile. As the legend goes, he was 18 years old when he returned to reclaim his homeland, defeating the mighty Sumaoro Jaraso and founding the powerful Mali Empire in 1235. The pre-teen Sunjata learned many things from his first 2 major teachers about family and community: the environment, the outside world, politics, mysticism, science, and history. The past, present, and the future all converged in the formal and informal education he received. Between his departure into exile and his return, Sunjata will go on to learn many other life lessons, those building on the foundation laid by his mother and his griot during his early childhood. His education was complete because Sunjata got to know all that needed to be known. As he approaches the end of his sprawling memoir, Amkoulel l'Enfant Peul, Amadou Patoimbasba offers the following assessment of the colonial school. And that is the quote on the screen right now. Colonization is never philanthropic, except in words. One goal of every colonial enterprise, wherever and whenever it may be, is always to clear the conquered territory. For one can sow neither in fallow nor in already cultivated land. Like so many weeds, the thought, values, customs, and local cultures must be turned up so that the values, customs, and culture of the colonizer can be sown in their place. For they alone are considered to be superior and of value. And what better way to accomplish this than through the school? In other words, it was through the school and the small army of middle figures it will produce that the colonizer planned to consolidate and make permanent his grip on Africa. This stage, where the school came in to play a very important role in the colonial enterprise, was referred to as the conquête morale or moral conquest by legendary school education administrator Georges Hardy. So the next slide is from Georges Hardy. The quote, "To transform the primitive populations of our colonies, to make them more devoted to our cause and useful to our affairs, we have few resources at our disposal. The most crucial of these involves taking in the native as a child, having him spend significant amount of time with us, and familiarizing him with our intellectual and moral habits for many years. In short, we should give him a school where his mind will be molded according to our intentions," end of quote. Consequently, the so-called colonial sub-Saharan indigenous bourgeoisie was a calculated creation of the colonial enterprise and the ideology that framed and infused it. In his preface to Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, Jean-Paul Sartre notes that, and I quote, "the European elite undertook to manufacture a native elite," end of quote. Colonial school policies were conceived and executed with the sole purpose of creating this class of so-called évolués, that is, men and women selected from the vast native populations and conditioned to be answerable only to the colonizer. According to Amadou Hampâté-Bâ, the colonial school system sought to satisfy three sectorial needs of the colonial administration. Number one, the public sector, that is teachers, subaltern functionaries, auxiliary doctors, so on and so forth. The second sector is the security sector. And the third is the domestic sector, which included servant boys, as they call them in French. The new class of évolués could be distinguished from the general mass of natives in three ways. Number one, by their knowledge of the French language, which ranges from rudimentary to varying degrees of complexity. Number two, by their proximity, physically speaking, to the white man, thanks mainly to their adoption of the French language and by their avowed or feigned loyalty to their bosses. And number three, by their manner of dress, food preferences, new moral values, relatively elevated standard of living in the modern sense, and general material culture. Marriage preferences, in short, their lifestyle. The French colonial system, through its schools, intended to create a highly stratified society that will be characterized by a three-tier social hierarchy. It will be like a pyramid, the white colonials constituting the summit, and at the base, the largely illiterate mass of natives. In her use of the pyramid imagery to talk about class distinctions in totalitarian societies, Hannah Arendt proposes that between the tip of the pyramid and its base, there is no real intermediary class. What we have is indeed a homogeneous agglomeration of instruments of violence used by occupiers of the apex to keep the vast base in check. And I quote from Hannah Arendt's book, Between Past and Future. The intervening layers between top and bottom were destroyed, so that the top remains suspended, supported only by the proverbial bayonets over a mass of carefully isolated, disintegrated, and completely equal individuals, end of quote. Similarly, between them and the colonized masses, the colonizers intended to put something that will at once separate and bring colonizer and colonized together. In most instances, the French discouraged or simply banned the pre-existing traditions and institutions of learning and writing. From its inception as a government-mandated system in 1817 in Senegal to its dissolution in the 1950s after the Second World War, colonial public education was always necessarily an instrument of social engineering and transformation. To fully appreciate the objective of colonial education, it will help to examine some specific means deployed to attain that objective. That is selection and recruitment of students, the curriculum, its content and its structure, pedagogical methods used, and the training of teachers and monitors. So we'll take a look at 2 or 3 of these. The first one is the selection and recruitment process. Given the utilitarian nature of public colonial education, the process of recruiting and selecting students was always a vector of the colonizers' anxieties and aspirations vis-a-vis the status and attitudes of the colonized. From the 1850s, when Louis Feder assimilated École des Otages, or School for Hostages, was available only to the sons of chiefs and other local dignitaries in Senegal in the 1930s, in the 1850s and beyond. From that period to the 1930s politics of rural education, there was never a time when colonial education was not rationed. The administration used a rigorous quota system at every stage of the process to determine which and how many students enter the school or could move from one level into another. In addition to the family origin of the children, the selection criteria included the character and personality of the students as determined by school officials with direct access to the students. No one expressed the anxieties, priorities, and aspirations of the colonizer more passionately and consistently than the aforementioned Georges Hardy, inspector of schools. He noted that in order to avoid future social upheaval, which he referred to as perturbation sociale, access to higher primary education, which was available to the natives at that time, should be given only to the children of families with proven loyalty to France. As for the rest, Hardy recommended, and I quote, "We must eliminate with merciless care all those, even the brilliant ones, who are not sufficiently stable, who risk using the education received from us to their own ends and imbibing the anxiety and cruelty of caged wolves," end of quote. The objective here, of course, is to preempt utilization of education by the natives for their self-expression and eventual self-emancipation. The cultural content of the education. As a matter of principles and practice, the education given to the select few from among the native populations should prevent the acquisition of knowledge considered potentially dangerous to imperial interest. Because the colonized pupil was a means to an end, its education could not be left to chance. So, extreme care was taken to delineate the subject matter to be taught and the manner in which it was to be taught. In what is clearly an echo of the official colonial education policy, the commandant in L'Odyssée de Mongo, the novel by Pierre Samé from Central Africa, gives the teacher of the first group of students forced to go to the school, and I quote the commandant, "I am not asking you to turn these niggers into learned men. Do not poison our existence with a class of pretentious and boastful scholars. I need auxiliaries, people who serve as intermediaries between us and the population. Teach them things borrowed from their environment, from their life. No grand theories, especially no philosophy. We don't need leaders, but henchmen. Let them serve us without asking questions and obey before understanding. If they manage to distinguish their right hand from their left, it is more than enough. No need for more," end of quote. And the next thing that the colonizer paid attention to was, of course, lessons in history and geography. If the teaching of language and literature withheld details that will potentially feed the fertile imagination of the colonized, The teaching of history took manipulation and indoctrination to a higher level through a carefully choreographed falsification and exaggeration of historical fact. The teaching of local history, which dates back to the 1910s in Africa, offers probably the most powerful weapon of propaganda available to the colonizer. Western imperial historiography insisted that the history of African people started with the arrival of Europeans on the continent. When and where colonizers considered that African history, cultures, and civilizations did exist prior to the arrival of Europeans, they sought to obscure these while portraying everything European as superior to anything African. The idea of African inferiority and concomitant French superiority was reinforced at every opportunity, including and especially in children's books. Nowhere was this French propaganda more blatant than in the student reader, Moussa Ejigla. The declared intention of the book's authors, this next quotation that you have on your screen, gives us the best picture into this view, which of course was to make the African native know and love France and to see it as the most glorious and advanced civilization, the one with the most courageous soldiers and historical figures, and above all, the land of those who have brought progress and prosperity to Africa. We see a reiteration of this idea in such texts as Amadou Mampate Jan's Trois Volontés de Mali, a text that Umar Sherif Diop and Dorothy Blair both characterize as an apology of the French colonial project. Arguably, all intentional education systems, including informal educational systems, are a means to an end, namely the creation of a specific kind of individual in a specific kind of society. Consequently, there is always already a certain degree of instrumentalization and social engineering inherent to all educational programs. However, the problem with colonial education, as with all systems engineered for indoctrination, oppression, and exploitation of one group by another, is that from its conception to its implementation, the interest of its wards or hostages, as some may refer to them, was at best an afterthought. If traditional pre-colonial education in Africa, despite its shortcomings, was homegrown, as in Sunjata's example, or adapted, as in the case of Islamic education, and thus focused for the most part on the needs and realities of its creators and beneficiaries, colonial education, for its part, was blatantly doctrinaire in its philosophy and practice. In Afrique et Occident, heures et malheurs d'une rencontre, Hubert Deleuze offers the following assessment of colonial education. And I quote, "With rare exception, the school is not up to its assigned mission. Instead of educating children, it distorts them through the harshness of its discipline. It does not inculcate in them a sense of personal responsibility or the desire for initiative. It doesn't make men out of them." Bernard Morales also makes a similar assessment in Littérature et Développement. As historian Suré Canal argues, the defect and eventual failure of the school were innate to the colonial system. It would be irrational to expect anything different from it. The first interactions of different peoples that colonization, like the slave trade before it, occasioned, was founded on an unequal power relation that was bound to produce a lopsided result. The specific, deliberate violence of slavery and colonialism made this historical truth all the more spectacular. Colonialism's carefully planned and choreographed agenda of political domination and economic exploitation, as well as cultural erasure, was unlike anything the continent had seen, even with its long history of intra-continental rivalries and conflicts. When children are put through an educational system built upon a policy of deprecation and depreciation of Africans, their cultures, their way of life, and their humanity, The outcome should not surprise. As Samba Gadiego asserts, l'école attire l'indigène, le sépare des siens, puis l'isole dans une situation ambiguë. The school attracts the native, separates him from his family, and then traps him in an ambiguous situation. More than an ambiguity, the school deposits its graduate in a sort of no man's land, that liminal space from which return to the preliminal is no longer possible. In the grand scheme of things, France was simply a black hole that sought, through the school and other colonial practices, to suck into itself other peoples, their cultures, their resources, and their aspirations. Everything about educational policy and implementation in Africa was intended for one goal: the success of the colonial project. In other words, the interest of France presented as the default interest in the relationship between French and Africans. An idea better explained again by the unflappable Georges Hardy, when he says, and I quote, "French West Africa is no longer or never was a land conquered by France. It is rather a land absorbed by France, an integral part of the French nation, just like Artois and Roussillon," end of quote. Colonialism is dead. Long live colonialism. The bourgeois elite of the colonial as well as the post-colonial periods have come under vehement and consistent criticism for their corrupt and exploitative practices, on the one hand, and their catastrophic failure to redress the dismal national situations on the other. They have been shown to exploit, not only for the pleasure of doing so, but especially because it is precisely their historical mission to do so. The kind of education this bourgeoisie, the members of this class received, did not prepare them for a positive role in their respective home societies. In the words of Bernard Morales, l'enseignement colonial forme des utilisateurs, non des créateurs. Colonial education produces users, not creators. The graduates of the school remained faithful to an individualistic education that modeled the exploitation of the majority by the few, largely incapable of formulating and implementing real socio-economic programs for community or national development, precisely because they lack the will, the material and intellectual means, the knowledge and mastery of the economic potential of their respective countries, or the critical mass necessary to achieve that goal. The African bourgeoisie that came out of the colonial school, even after 6 decades of independence, continues to be a mostly comprador bourgeoisie, to quote Frantz Fanon, consuming foreign commodities far more than they are producing value internally. The bourgeoisie portrayed in much of African literature is bourgeois not by virtue of its business acumen or moral or organizational strength, but as a result of its access to the instruments of power and the natural and human resources of their respective countries. Unlike their Western counterparts, who matured from their birth in the Middle Ages to the summit of their power and glory in the contemporary age, the national bourgeoisies of African states have not had a long and genuine period of incubation and growth. As any byproduct of a colonialist project, it is portrayed as a modern African Frankenstein with no identifiable pre-modernity. Europe did not care to develop a genuine bourgeois class in its former colonies. This class, which was never truly weaned from its creator's bosom because of continued Western interference over matters of culture, politics, and economics in Africa, it has had neither the space and time nor the will to grow organically. I would like to conclude my presentation by saying a few words specifically about the education of girls in the colonial period. I'm going to stop sharing while I do this, if I can get to doing so. 1 second. All right, 1 second, I'll stop sharing. Right, here we go. The education of girls was almost an afterthought in colonial education policy and practice. When the issue finally caught the imagination of the colonizer nearly a century after the institution of boys' education, the intention of the colonizer was the same as for the education of boys. Even with a school like the École Normale de Jeunes Filles de Rufisque, founded in 1938, thanks to the efforts of Germain Le Goff, Pascal Barthélemy contends that, and I quote, "The desire was less about training teachers than it was about molding new women." Such was clearly the case, the wish of authorities who utilized educational institutions to fabricate a feminist minority, a feminine minority conditioned to personify a Franco-African culture imagined by the colonizer, end of quote. This creation of new women was in turn connected to the desire on the part of the colonizer to establish maximum control over the African family, which he saw as central to the perpetuation of the colonial enterprise. That said, the institutions the women attended also provided them a much coveted entry into the privileged colonial space and its accompanying access to power and material security, among other privileges. This is clearly demonstrated in Frida Lawson's Je suis une Africaine, j'ai 20 ans, Mariam Abbas, une si longue lettre, Awa Keita's Femme d'Afrique, La vie d'Awa Keita racontée par elle-même, among many other texts by women writing about their experience during this period in Africa. Since marriage and motherhood constituted the main justification for the investment in girls' education, the colonizer realized the surest way to keep the educated African male civilized and from marrying white women was by educating African women also, thereby making them potential wives to the new male elite. After 1918, the French started looking at African women as and I quote, the primary bearers of archaic cultures and as impediments to genuine male acculturation to metropolitan values, end of quote. And this is from Conklin. If French women were sent to the colonies to retrieve their men who were being decivilized by their interracial relationships with native women were also made to carry the burden of protecting the investment of civilization made by the colonial school in their men. As intermediaries and vectors of new ideas about health and hygiene, teachers, midwives, and nurses, educated women served as much needed link between the colonizer and local indigenous populations. As a teacher, for example, the woman could reach potentially exponentially more Africans, children, their families, and their communities. The girls came from every corner of the African Federation and could be sent back after graduation to work in places far from their hometowns or home countries. These women will be the new missionaries embedded in the recesses of uncivilized Africa, plagued by ignorance, disease, factors that threaten the viability of the French Empire. Together with their évolué husbands, these African women would constitute the foot soldiers of the force that will allow the European colonizer, the French here more specifically, to change and control Africa forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kamara, for your presentation, which is outstanding. I want to let you know that we have viewers from various parts of the world. We have viewers from Cape Verde, viewers from Nigeria, from Canada, Sierra Leone, and various cities in the United States. Here, I wanted to let people, know that they can post their questions on YouTube, and I will relay the questions to Mohamed Kamara for further extensions. Before having, other questions, I would like, to ask Mohamed Kamara a question that prepared for him, just let's say to ask people, let's say, to follow suit. My first question is about, let's say, a passage, Mohamed Kamara, you wrote on, let's say, in your book. It's from pages 7 to 8, and I will read, let's say, the part before asking you the question. It's written that all said and done, Africans were educated in the colonial school, neither for the African societies nor for admission into the society of the colonizer. Ultimately, the indigenous elite that came out of the school seemed to be doomed from its very conception. Some critics and writers have insisted that this class, in spite of its role, or perhaps because of it, the acquisition of African political independence continues to serve as an intermediary between the former colonizers and independent countries in a relationship that has invariably been referred to as neo-colonialist and neo-imperialist. Here, my question is this: how did the colonial education system failure to adequately prepare Africans for either integration into their old societies or full acceptance into the colonizer's society contribute to the development of hybrid identities and feelings of alienations among the educated African elite?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Thank you very much. And so to the quote that you just read back, of course, establishes this conundrum, right, in which the African elite found themselves. That is, they were deposited in a no man's land. Because of the school, they could no longer be an integral part of their so-called original societies. And because of that same school, and the refusal of the French, if you will, to accept, first of all, the full humanity of the Africans, in spite of what they said, that they will not accept the Africans fully as members of the European and French society. And so which makes this particular class, the members of this class, half-baked entities in that sense, right? And fundamentally, the French, like all other colonizers, had absolutely no intention to make the African educational system viable, if you will, for Africa. And the primary interest, of course, is to produce these intermediary figures who will basically become instruments in the hands of the colonizer for the exploitation in all shape and form of African human and natural and cultural resources. And so that education itself, even after independence, was not enough because these men and women had not been trained to think about the interest of their own societies, to think about the interest of their own people. And because of this new society that this traumatic contact between Europe and Africa had engineered and had produced a society that was no longer African in that sense, it is impossible for these men and women to operate effectively, positively within that space, of course, that they themselves did not create, that space that they had no control over, and that they continue to lack control over, as we see in modern politics, right, and society. And so, in short, the colonial educational system was not a failure. It was a great success at a particular level, in the sense that it failed to produce Africans that understood their individual societies and that were interested in improving the lot of that society. It was not a complete success for the French because human beings are not tabula rasa. Every society has its own history and culture. And so the French realized that there was no way they would control 100% African societies, of course, which is why we ended up having the clamor for independence, right? But ultimately, the education did not benefit the Africans. It benefited the French mostly, and the Africans little, if any, at all. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for your answer. We have a question, let's say that Simon, let's say, posted on the chat. And the question reads as follows. The explicitness of the colonial administration's purposes is telling. Now the question, have subsequent French administrations fully acknowledged the cultural harm that was done? President Biden finally apologized let's say yesterday, for the cultural harm done by boarding schools for Native Americans. Has France offered any formal apology?
Yeah, so wonderful question. And as you mentioned in your introduction, of course, this is an issue that is still with us. It is still relevant, right? Because colonial practices continue to be in existence today in every part of the world. Jacques Chirac is probably the closest French leader that came the closest to apologizing, first of all, for slavery, but also when he famously said that there will be no France without Africa, in the sense that the economic and modern development of France is intricately linked to the exploitation of African resources, right? But also, in so many ways, the creation of a museum like the Quai Branly, which houses artifacts from non-European countries, including parts of the world, including Africa, in a way, is an acknowledgement of what the French did, while at the same time still hosting things, artifacts that were stolen from Africa. And they're still refusing to give those things back to Africa. So Jacques Chirac is the French leader that has come the closest. Whereas someone like Nicolas Sarkozy, for example, I think it was in 2005, his visit to Dakar, or 2007, when he deliberately actually made an apology for colonization, right? This is long after Chirac left office, I would say, refusing to acknowledge the harm done by colonization. And this is one of the instigators, actually, for me for writing this book, is because we continue to have people like Sarkozy and the current, of course, and always pertinent role of the French educational system in metropolitan France, refusing to teach colonial harms that were done to other parts of the world. And so the answer is really no. There's been no real apology for what France has done. There's been noises here and there, but there's no coherent statement from the French government as a whole to fully and completely, unequivocally apologize for colonization and the harms that were done by colonization. I give kudos to Joe Biden. It's never too late to acknowledge, what has happened in the case of Native Americans is precisely what happened in Africa as well.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Kamara. We have another question from Simon, which reads, how about film representations of French colonial education? I have sometimes used Keita Héritage Griot, which offers a really good critique of the Eurocentrism of French language education. Do you have anything to say about that one?
Okay, could you repeat the question, please?
The question reads, how about film representations of French colonial education? Yeah.
Yes. So, of course, Keita L'Héritage de Griot, it's a wonderful, wonderful film, one of my favorite. And I really hope there was a sequel to it, which goes to the heart of the matter, right? And so this internal war amongst Africans as to which way to go, the value of our traditional educational systems without rejecting entirely, the colonial legacy education system. The other theme that I will talk about, for example, is Sango Malo, and which looks from a different perspective, but not so much at grassroots education, right? Homegrown grassroots education, to some extent from a Marxist perspective or a socialist perspective, to look at education that focuses on the community, that looks at education that focuses on the resources of that community and how those resources, both human and natural, could be harnessed, if you will, for the betterment of the community itself. And of course, there is some rejection of that colonial mentality that we see in Keita, L'Héritage de Griot, that we also see in Sango Malo. But both movies also tell us a lot about the confusion, if you will, of African identity. So that battle that as Africans we have to fight as to where we belong and how we can carve for ourselves an identity that acknowledges that colonial history, because it is part of us. There's no way we can completely extricate ourselves from it, and how we can marry that with what the colonizer tried to destroy, but was not entirely successful in doing. And I think those two themes are the ones that come to mind. The one mentioned by Simon Keita, but also Sango Malo as well. And there are other themes where education is touched on a little bit, and Le Grand Blanc de Lambaréné, the Great White Man of Lambaréné, is another example, even though the educational system itself is not its focus, but there are moments there where, especially the education of the little boy Kumba, becomes one of those minuscule focus on the question of education itself.
Yeah, thank you very much. If I can add, let's say, another movie, another film, it's Le Cri du Cœur by Idrissa Ouedraogo, released, let's say, in 1994, which also, let's say, is about, let's say, education and, let's say, this life of hybridity, being African, also living in Europe, or, let's say, trying to come to terms with, let's say, these different cultures inherited from colonization, which is also interesting.
Exactly. And also, just quickly, I just remember, even Khala, even though it is focusing on the modern bourgeoisie, it takes us back to the origins of that class, right? So Sembène Ousmane's film, Khala.
Yeah, exactly. I have a question about, let's say, this bourgeoisie and this évolué African, let's say, intellectual. How do you situate now, let's say, the negritude, and how do you situate also the independence? Because we know that those people fought to get, let's say, to gain independence. How do you situate that in your work when you talk about, let's say, the creation of the bourgeoisie, this intellectual, let's say, class that does not work for Africans, playing, let's say, the intermediary, but also, let's say, working to, I would say, to go against Africa itself? How do you situate then, let's say, the negritude? How do you situate the fight for independence?
Yeah, so good question. In fact, if there was a failure of the colonial educational project, is precisely the pro-independent movement, right? Because the French, like other colonizers, as we saw in that quotation from Georges Hardy, the goal was the prevention of la perturbation sociale, social upheaval. Right, the goal was never to give the Africans enough education to clamor for their independence, right? To fight for their independence. So in that regard, colonial education failed because what it refused to take into consideration, this is the arrogance of the system itself, is that the Africans were not tabula rasa, that the Africans were human beings independent of what the French thought of them, that they had the intellectual capacity to understand at the very least, at the very minimum, that they were different, that they had their own interests as well. And so, of course, this education that was not intended to do that at the same time gave us this elite that led the independence movement, right? The problem, of course, is, and the role, of course, negritude is significant to that. One of the criticisms levied against someone like Léopold Sédar Senghor is that he was too pro-French. And there's truth to the fact that he was pro-French, although I will not say he was too pro-French. But of course, if you read Senghor, if you read his poetry, if you read his essays, he was one of the most vehement critics of colonization. Okay, even though at some point he argued against early independence for Senegal. But his writings indicate, and the creation of the negritude movement itself indicates a very complete and perspicacious understanding of the harm that colonization was doing to the people. And so negritude played that role because, of course, it also became a training ground for this elite that will fight to reclaim their independence, political independence, through, first of all, understanding their specific cultural heritage and how that is linked to the future political and economic development of the African continent. So, but these elites that fought for independence, in a way, gave us independence. There's a debate, of course, about that. The fact that it was not properly educated. You had few, of course, who went to France to study, etc., but that education in France was also a colonial educational system. They were taught that European culture, European civilizations were best, even though later on, through the readings of other European writings like Frobenius and Delafosse by Senghor, etc., they were able to understand that the picture was much more complex than that. So there is that tension, right? That irony in a way that this class that was trained to help France to control the continent, it was the same class that fought the French, of course, with tremendous support from the so-called uneducated masses to regain an independence. The question that is posed is, what is the value of that independence? What has that independence done for the African peoples if these countries continue to do precisely the bidding of the former colonizer, as we know? So we are still, over 6 decades later, we are still not completely independent. And of course, God knows what will have happened if leaders like Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara had been left alone to do what they wanted to do.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. We have a question from Akashi Ezegbo, which reads, what would you consider to be gains for Africa and African peoples derived from colonial education? Or was the education completely negative or harmful to Africa? Was it all a depressing experience?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. So I could take 30 minutes to answer it, but I'm gonna just do that in a minute. I would say that the educational system itself provided was not entirely negative for 2 reasons. Number one, it disrupted the caste system. And as we see in Les Soleils des Indépendances, but also especially in Le Ministre et le Griot, is that it allowed members of the erstwhile lower caste, people that will never have occupied positions of political authority. This education democratized the system in a way, because there's this scene in Le Ministre et le Griot where Demba, who is a descendant of griots, comes to class and he sits in front of the son of the chief. And they want to change position. We see the same thing in Amkulel, L'Enfant Pearl. And the teacher says, no. You leave all of that stuff be on the other side of the river. In this class, you are all the same, right? And in Le Ministre et le Griot, Demba becomes the prime minister, and Keita, who is a descendant of the nobility, becomes his finance minister. And his mother is not happy about that because it is supposed to be the other way around, right? So in terms of the disruption of that hierarchy, one could consider that that French educational system was positive. The other thing is that of the role and status of women. The École Normale de Jeunes Filles, I mentioned Germaine Le Goff, who was the first director of the École Normale de Rufisque. This woman, of course, was functioning within the colonial system, but he was different in the sense that he was the only high-ranking colonial educational figure who actually saw the African women as fully bona fide members of the society. And so she wanted to train them to be equal with the men, right? Because she saw them as potentially contributors to the future development of Africa. So in many of these societies, some of these women who otherwise would not have had a significant role to play directly in the agora, in the public space, that educational system gave them the opportunity to do so. And Mariam Abbas in Si Longue, actually, she talks about that in that novel. She mentions Germaine Le Goff without necessarily mentioning her name. In Awakate's book, we see the fact that she went to colonial school in Dakar when she came back and became a woman who could make decisions on her own, going against her family, especially her mother. So for those two reasons, one can say that the colonial educational system was positive.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a remark, let's say, kind of contribution from Simon, which reads, Afrique, je te plumerai is great on the post-independence continuation of European language education, ideological inculcation via institutions like the Alliance Française, Goethe Institute, British Council. And a question from Saidou Bangoura, which reads, how can we How can we between bracket, neo-colonize the educational system, considering African languages and cultures and the languages of the colonizers? So if I can reread it, how can we decolonize or neo-colonize the educational system?
Thank you, Dr. Bangura, for that question. So I have a ready-made answer to that question.
Thank you.
So my ready-made answer is this: the Gambia Academy. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
I don't think so.
The Gambia Academy. So all of those of you listening, you can Google it. The Gambia Academy is founded by the kora player, the female kora virtuoso Sona Jobate, the Anglo-Gambian musician. So she founded this institute, and in fact, precisely what she is doing is completely decolonizing education in Africa. Her starting point is Africa. Her middle point is Africa. Her end point is Africa. She does not completely reject Western learning because she knows you cannot do that, right? We live in a global society. But this is an educational system that is grounded, first of all, in African history. And that version of African history that doesn't put the European on top of the human ladder. That is grounded in African culture. And as a musician herself, and she knows the value of music and how music can be a vector, if you will, an opportunity to teach Africans about their own history. And she is a descendant of that long line of griots, the Jobates, et cetera, et cetera. And so check that institution out, which is in development right now. And Sona Jobate is, for me, the poster example, and the work that she does as a poster example of what it means to decolonize the educational system. And as we are reminded that she played in Dallas in 2012 at the African Literature Conference. So it is possible to do that. It just takes the will and the resources and the foresight of somebody like Sonia Jobate for that to happen. So it's definitely doable.
Okay, thank you very much. On a kind of completely different, let's say, topic, I would say I want to relate, let's say, your book and what you said in it to what occurred, let's say, just I would say a week or 10 days ago at the UN during voting against, let's say, colonization. We see that 2 countries in Africa refrain from voting. Do you see a kind of link between, let's say, this refusal to vote to condemn colonization and the fact that African elite, the évolués, have been, let's say, set in a kind of intermediary level where it's very difficult for them not only to consider the desires and aspirations of the population, and also to try to condone not only, but also to accept what, let's say, the colonizers, former colonizers said. Can we say that the refusal is linked to this sense of bourgeoisie, this sense of not decolonizing the mind today?
Yeah, so of course, those countries that abstain from that, for whatever reason, we may disagree with them, but that is beside the point, right? The motion itself is important in that sense because number one, it acknowledges a historical fact, an undeniable historical fact, the one that we can go around, but it's the so-called elephant in the room. And whether or not we acknowledge it, it is there, and there's nothing we can do about it. But confronting it is important for the specific reason that it will serve a purpose for us. But people have their reasons, for opposing certain things, right? And this could be personal, and the question of the interest of nations, the question of interest of Africa as a continent itself, has always been a divisive one, right? That is why for a long time we have this, and to some extent that is still going on, this idea of divide and conquer, which is part of the colonial policy, right? So this division within the African continents among the Francophone, for example, and the Anglophone. So the wing led by Senghor and the others, and the wing led by the Nigerians, and how do we coordinate and realize African unity? Of course, Europe knew that they will have to stop that from happening. But the interest, whether they are national interest or political interest, individual political interest, have always stepped in, if you will, to prevent the continent from realizing the goal of true independence. And it could be that that is what is at play here, right? And the details of that maybe we will know later, but it is disheartening that reality is still going on. And some of the movements we see right now on the ground, the so-called Pan-Africanist movement and the so-called liberation movement. And again, with these new leaders, including the coup leaders in Niger, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, claiming to be liberators of Africa. Of course, I don't see them as liberators of Africa. They are more interested, in my perspective, in maintaining power. And this goes also for people like Ahmed Sékou Touré, the father of Guinean independence, who ended up being a sanguinary despot. What good is that to the continent? And so this conflict of interest, how do we go about resolving the differences that pull us apart, right, in order for us to create a united force? It could be that six decades or more later, we still have these influences at play. Even though they are waning now, the influence of the French, for example, but in pockets, that influence is still there. And so it is impossible to imagine that behind the scenes, or not even behind the scenes, openly, that the colonizers are still, ils sont toujours en train de manigancer. They're still manipulating, yes. If you will.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Kamara. And I want you to say a word about, let's say, your conclusion. You titled it A Literature About Failure. Can you expand on that, let's say, for our viewers, our listeners?
Yeah. So, if you know this, that much of the literature about Africa, talking about whether it's post-independent or pre-independent, that talks about this class, right? That talks about the new rulers. They are presented generally as negative figures. If you take Ayikwe Amos, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born.
Yeah.
For example, the opening of that novel alone, right, gives us this idea of this rampant corruption and rottenness in this independent African state, right? And so from there, we see the negativity that permeates from the very opening chapter. You blood, something, bloody fucking mother, son of a bitch, whatever it is. All the way to the end, we see that. If you look at Ake Loba's Les Fils de Kurecha, you see that in there, Bernananga, etc., hala. It's all negative. It's just that gallery of figures, of entities who are serving only themselves and the colonizer. And so when I refer to it as a literature about failure, and probably even of failure, it's precisely that. That is what the literature tells us. That is why the movies about African independent societies tell us. That is why those movies, in general and more specifically about this elite, tell us is that they have consistently failed their people, and they continue to do so.
So you mean disenchantment then?
Disenchantment, that's the word. That's
Yeah,
what these writers feel. So we are still in search of our independence, if you will.
Okay. Thank you very much. So if I can proceed with maybe one or two questions before we wrap up. Can you also, let's say something about the following question? In what ways did the gendered approach to education, as outlined in the education of girls, mainly, align with or diverge from the overall colonial educational mission in AOF?
So REF and AOF?
Mainly in AOF.
Okay. Could you read that again?
Yeah. In what ways did the gendered approach to education? Because I think, let's say, when you were presenting, you mentioned the fact that there is also this kind of schools for girls.
Yes.
In Rufis, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And in what ways did the gendered approach to education, as outlined in the education of girls, align with or diverge from the overall colonial educational mission?
Yeah. And as I mentioned, so the education of women, as far as colonial education is concerned, was an afterthought, and it happened, even though on and off in the colony like Senegal, the missionaries had been involved in the education of women, mostly, in the religious schools. It took about 100 years before it became an official, for example, French policy to educate women, because the women, again, were always considered at the very best as secondary citizens of members of society, not citizens, because the idea of citizenship is a whole different ballgame. Okay. And even when the education of women, appeared in the orbit of the colonizer, that education itself focused mostly on home economics, right? And the school was a home. It was always presented as a home. The classroom itself was a replica of the house that the woman is supposed to run after leaving the school. And so later on, of course, they were also trained as nurses, as sage-femme, for example, and then eventually, thanks to Germaine Le Goff, they started training them as teachers. That is where we see that big division when Germaine Le Goff decided that, yeah, we need nurses, we need women who can cook and who can clean, but we also needed women who can be teachers, who can work in the colonial administration. So we see the evolution even within the French system itself. But when Germaine Le Goff finally wanted to create a school, she received a lot of opposition from higher authorities because they did not want that institution. They didn't want women to be trained beyond being nurses and wives. That was not their interest. So there's that flexibility within the system itself in the colonial period.
Yeah, thank you very much. In 2016, Felwinster published Afrotopia, which is about, let's say, the utopia of an African development economically, mainly, and also, I would say, this kind of decolonizing the mind. And when I consider your work, your works, Afrotopia and your book, do you see a kind of, I would say, what's the place of Africa, finally, or the African intellectual, maybe in 20, 30, or even 15 years? How do you locate Africa in 20, 25 years within the framework not only of this school that I would say undermined the elite, and also with the idea of the utopia of the development? How do you personally locate Africa in the future?
Yeah, so we clearly have a lot of work to do, right? As the literature has shown us, of course, we don't lack lack intellectuals. We have people, thinkers. We have bona fide philosophers. So people who know the right thing to do. But how do we do that right thing has been the thorny issue on our side, right? And you start, of course, by harnessing the resources that we have that are disparate all over the place, intellectual, political, cultural, is to have the space, the capacity to harness those resources, which the former colonizer and the present neo-colonizer doesn't want Africa to do, right? So for Africa and this goes back to the heart of negritude. The early negritude was interested in bringing Black people to the table, in showing the rest of the world that Black people matter. They were no less or more than Europeans or other peoples, right? And so what we ought to do, first of all, is to continue that work, whether or not we agree with negritude, is, this table, when is Africa going to be a part of that table? And what is going to be our role in it? Because we are important. We know that we are relevant, but we should not simply be in suppliers of resources to others. But how do we, first of all, identify ourselves, organize ourselves into such a force that no one can ignore us? And the answer to that question is we need to do it, but how we do it is what all of us, of course, have to think about, right? And put forward, harnessing both the resources of men and women and the resources of children and the African youth today, which constitutes the largest part of the population, and putting all of that together. And of course, have leaders that will understand that and do this work of putting the interest of our nations and our peoples first and above everything else.
Yeah, I see. Thank you very much. This reminds us, reminds me personally of, Utonji's recapturing, where he's asking Africans to stop, this extraversion of intellectuals, this extraversion of resources, and resources in any kind of resources.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Mohamed Kamara, for your presentation today, which is really outstanding. Before, finishing everything, before I give, Simon the last, the possibility of closing everything, do you have a last word, something you want, to share with your viewers, with your readers?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. And again, this work was in the making for a long time. But because the same thing keeps happening, right? So the former colonizers keep still playing the same games. I felt the need to write it. It's not revolutionary at all. It's just basically recapturing things that are out there, things that we all know and that we all do into one structure, especially linking that education to the ruling systems that we have and how that process itself continues as we go on. The most important thing, of course, is for us to rethink ourselves. The European legacy is part of our legacy. That colonization that lasted for so long, we cannot excise from our experience. So the goal is, as I conclude in my book, is how do we harness whatever value might come out of that education, whatever value might exist within that European view of itself and contact with us, and go back to our past and take from our past what is good in the past, because not everything about our past is positive, right? So how do we take the values, the positive values in both the past and in the present, but also throughout history, putting that together in order to create a new society for the benefit of all. So if anything, I hope that this book helps to contribute or contributes to that process of rethinking the history of Africa, the history of education, and the role of Africans themselves in their own identity creation, in their own progress, in their future, but also in the future of the world as a whole.
Yeah, thank you very much. Africa is now in the global, with influences coming from everywhere, with influences even, let's say, in hands, as we know today. Many countries are trying to interact with the continent, giving education from everywhere, from every continent. So thank you very much, Mohamed Kamara. This will allow Africans to really rethink their presence in the global.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Mr. Simon, I'll be pleased, let's say, to hand you the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very much, Professors Kamara and Nikiema. That was absolutely wonderful, amazing, wide-ranging, going back into the history, and then really thinking very thoughtfully and philosophically about the future, which is appropriate because we are, as an association, as the African Literature Association, we are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. So we are looking back at our own past, and obviously, again, looking to the future beyond that. So the next lecture in the series on November the 23rd is going to take a slightly different format than these ones that we've had most recently. It's going to take the format of a roundtable discussion involving 5 former presidents of the African Literature Association, going back to 1981, when Aliko Songolo was president, Carol Boyce Davis, who was president in 2000, Lokengaka Losambe, who was president in 2011, and then up to date with Moradewin Adejunmobi, who was president in 2015, and Juliana Nfa Abeni, who was president in 2016. And they are all going to be in conversation with Joya Urezi, who was our president in 2023 and 2024. So that is going to be a roundtable discussion. Please be thinking about the kinds of things that you would like the African Literature Association to be addressing in the future, and come with questions for all of those past presidents next time we're up here, which will be, as I said, Saturday, November the 23rd, same time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But until then, thank you again to Professor Kamara, wonderful, wonderful lecture, and to Professor Nikiema for wonderfully handling all the questions in the moderation and the Q&A session. Thank you very much also to all of you for watching from all over the place, Cape Verde, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Cameroon, Canada, and all over the United States. It's absolutely wonderful to be able to reach out to you in this fashion without any cost to anybody. So thank you very much, and we will see you next time.